Houston, please. Where you at, ma'am? I don't want to see it in your head, you understand? Where's she at?
Okay, what's...
It was supposed to be a night like any other, a respected deputy, a trusted man in uniform, but by dawn, his wife was dead, and the man sworn to uphold the law found himself at the center of a murder investigation. Was it a tragic accident, or a chilling betrayal hidden behind a badge? Tonight, we uncover the full story, every hidden crack, every explosive secret, only here, where no detail is too dark to reveal. This is the case of Deputy Renard Spivey.
Welcome to Dark Chronicles, where shadows hide the truth.
It all began with a frantic 911 call in the early morning hours of July 28, 2019. Shots fired, the man said, his voice heavy, strained. His name? Renard Spivey. A longtime sheriff's deputy. A man trusted with authority, with a badge, with a gun. But that morning, it wasn't a suspect he was calling about. It was his wife. Patricia Spivey lay inside their Houston home, bleeding, dying. He told dispatchers it was an accident. A tussle over a gun. But the reality that unfolded would soon challenge every word he said, and shatter every illusion people had about Deputy Spivey. Before that night, Renard Spivey seemed like the model officer. A bodybuilder, a TV bailiff on the reality show Justice for All with Judge Cristina Perez. A man who presented himself as the embodiment of calm authority. Off-screen, he lived with Patricia, his wife of several years, in a house they built together. Their life looked perfect from the outside, smiles and photos, trips together, social media posts filled with love. But behind the smiles, tension simmered. Fights over intimacy, over control, over secrets Patricia suspected Renard was keeping. Fights that would eventually turn deadly. After the 911 call, first responders arrived to a scene drenched in confusion and horror. Patricia, 52 years old, was found dead in the closet, shot multiple times. Renard, bleeding from a gunshot wound to the leg, claimed they had been struggling for the gun when it accidentally discharged. Once. Twice. 3 times. But the officers on the scene immediately had questions. How does a gun accidentally fire multiple times? How does a man standing 6 feet 3 inches and weighing nearly 290 pounds lose control to his smaller wife? And why, despite his law enforcement training, had Renard not been able to de-escalate the situation? Police detained Renard and took him to the hospital. He refused to talk without an attorney. Meanwhile, Patricia's family, still reeling from the shock, began piecing together a version of events they had long feared but never imagined would end like this. Her daughter, Patrina Marshall, described her mother's relationship with Renard as strained, filled with arguments and silences. Others close to Patricia said Renard had become increasingly controlling, jealous even of her friendships. Some hinted at suspected steroid use. Mood swings. A growing distance, the investigation moved quickly. Autopsy reports revealed Patricia had suffered multiple gunshot wounds. One fatal shot pierced her heart and lungs. Others struck her arm and chest. The medical examiner ruled it a homicide, an intentional killing. And just like that, the public face of Deputy Renard Spivey, the charming bailiff, the bodybuilder, the lawman, began to crumble. Prosecutors painted a damning picture, a marriage disintegrating, a man fueled by jealousy and rage, a struggle ending not in accident, but in murder. Surveillance cameras inside the Spivey home captured snippets of that fatal night. An argument. Raised voices. 3 gunshots, fired in quick succession. And a suspicious 4th sound, prosecutors claimed, suggesting Renard shot himself to support a story of mutual struggle. Renard's defense team pushed back hard. They insisted Patricia had been the aggressor. That she had pulled the gun first. That Renard had tried to wrestle it away, resulting in the tragic shooting. They emphasized his injuries. His emotional 911 call. His lack of a prior criminal record. They pointed to the model of gun used, a semi-automatic Smith & Wesson with no external safety, arguing that a slight pressure on the trigger could easily result in an unintended discharge. But critics noticed troubling details. In the 911 call, Renard referred to Patricia only as the patient, not my wife. It took him over 2 minutes to even say he shot her. And during the call, when urged to perform CPR, he seemed detached, taking unexplained breaks. Was it the confusion of a man in shock? Or the calculated behavior of someone trying to craft a narrative? The courtroom became a battleground of perception. Patricia's friends and family testified about the cracks in the marriage. The arguments. The suspicions. The emotional distance. Meanwhile, Renard's attorneys presented him as a man cornered by a sudden, shocking threat. A husband who loved his wife but was forced to act in the chaos of a dark night. The prosecution had no direct eyewitnesses, no video of the actual shooting, no definitive proof of whose finger was on the trigger. It all came down to interpretation, to who the jury believed more. To whether doubt could be erased beyond reason. Outside the courtroom, the case ignited debates across Houston. Was this another example of a man in power getting away with murder? Was it proof that badges protect even the guilty? Or was it a tragic accident, fueled by the lethal combination of distrust, fear, and a loaded gun in the dark? 5 years passed from Patricia's death to Renard's trial, delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic and legal battles. During that time, Renard remained under house arrest, wearing an ankle monitor, until he successfully petitioned to have it removed. He tried to move on with his life, even joining dating apps, a decision that infuriated Patricia's grieving family. Finally, in November 2023, Renard stood trial for murder. The prosecution argued he killed Patricia in a fit of rage after she threatened to leave him. The defense countered with the theory of a tragic accident, a struggle between a husband and wife that ended horribly wrong. After 12 hours of deliberations over 2 tense days, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence as the words rang out, "Not guilty." Renard collapsed in tears. Patricia's family sat stunned, devastated. Justice, they believed, had slipped away, and as the dust settled, one truth remained: Patricia Spivey was dead. Renard Spivey was free. And a cloud of questions, about love, anger, power, and the deadly consequences of mistrust, still hangs heavy over everyone who remembers that night. Renard Spivey's acquittal did not erase the questions that clung to the case like smoke. It only deepened the divide between two versions of the truth, one that saw him as a grieving husband caught in a deadly accident, and another that painted him as a man who let pride and anger pull the trigger. Even among seasoned law enforcement officers who once worked beside Renard, opinions split sharply. Some quietly admitted the facts didn't add up. Others stood by him, insisting that the Renard they knew was incapable of intentional harm. But public sentiment was not so forgiving. To many, it was yet another example of a justice system that protects its own. Patricia's family was left to pick up the pieces, mourning a daughter, a mother, a friend who would never come back. Her daughter Patrina struggled with the verdict, feeling as though her mother's voice had been lost in a courtroom where reasonable doubt loomed larger than truth. For Patrina, her mother wasn't just another face in a tragic headline. Patricia had been her anchor, her safe place, the glue that held their family together. Losing her so violently, and then seeing the man responsible walk free, was a second betrayal, a second wound that would never heal. At the center of the courtroom drama was the gun, a Smith & Wesson MP9, a semi-automatic pistol notorious among experts for its hair trigger sensitivity. The defense hammered this point home relentlessly, showing jurors how a slight tug during a struggle could result in rapid, unintended discharges. The prosecution, however, argued that even with a sensitive trigger, 3 shots could not simply be chalked up to panic or clumsiness. 1 accidental shot? Maybe. 2. Highly unlikely. 3. Impossible to accept without believing that Renard Spivey had lost control, not of the gun, but of his temper. The surveillance footage from the Spivey home offered chilling glimpses into that night. In the hours leading up to the shooting, Patricia posted cryptic messages on Facebook, hinting at deep frustration and betrayal. At one point, she was seen at the kitchen table, appearing tense, shutting off her phone when Renard approached. Later, she was caught on camera muttering, "It's the same thing over and over again." Minutes later, 3 gunshots tore through the night. Those recordings didn't capture the shooting itself, but the audio was damning. 3 rapid-fire shots, spaced seconds apart. Then, a minute and a half later, a 4th sound, different, softer. Prosecutors argued that was the shot Renard fired into his own leg, a desperate act to sell the story of a deadly struggle, yet Renard's defense team dismissed the 4th sound entirely, claiming it was nothing more than a background noise, a camera activating, a mechanical click. No proof, they said, that another bullet ever left the gun after Patricia was shot. And without clear proof, reasonable doubt crept into the jury room like a shadow. The prosecution's strongest emotional weapon was Ezra Washington, a close friend of Patricia's, who testified that Renard had called him the night of the shooting, ranting about losing the house, about not letting Patricia win. But under cross-examination, Ezra's credibility was attacked. There were no phone records backing up his claims, and in a case built on circumstantial evidence, that whole mattered. Even with the inconsistencies, many in the courtroom felt the weight of Renard's physical presence. Towering, imposing. He was not a man easily overpowered. Why, then, would he need to shoot? Why would a trained officer, schooled in de-escalation, resort to deadly force against a woman he outweighed by more than 100 pounds? Renard's attorneys countered that size didn't matter in the chaos of fear, especially when facing the muzzle of a loaded gun. They argued that Patricia's anger had reached a boiling point. That she had armed herself in a moment of rage. That Renard had reacted out of instinct, out of survival, not malice. The jury, tasked with sorting truth from theory, deliberated for 2 long days. They asked to rehear portions of the 911 call. They reviewed the surveillance evidence. They weighed the credibility of witnesses. In the end, it came down to the burden of proof. Not guilt. Not innocence. But whether the state had erased every shadow of doubt. And when the foreman stood up and delivered the words, "Not guilty," the courtroom erupted, some in gasps of relief, others in sobs of disbelief. Outside the courthouse, Renard Spivey thanked God, his family, and his legal team. He spoke of redemption, of moving forward, of honoring Patricia's memory in his own way. But to Patricia's loved ones, it felt hollow. How could you honor someone you claimed to love, someone whose life ended with 3 bullets from your own gun? Media coverage of the trial sparked fierce debates. True crime forums dissected every angle. Every theory. Was Renard's calm demeanor during the 911 call evidence of shock, or guilt? Was the surveillance footage ambiguous, or incriminating? Was the 4th sound truly a gunshot, or a coincidence seized upon by desperate prosecutors? The answers depended on who you asked. And in the absence of certainty, the tragedy took on a life of its own, morphing into a cautionary tale about love turned violent, about how quickly respect and trust can curdle into suspicion and fear. In the aftermath, Renard tried to rebuild his life. He volunteered with community groups. He attended church. He leaned on the support of friends who had never doubted his innocence. But even freedom came with shadows. His career in law enforcement was over. His brief fame as a TV bailiff had crumbled. And every time his name surfaced in the news, it came attached to the same haunting headline: Deputy Spivey, cleared of killing his wife. Patricia's family, meanwhile, was left to wrestle with grief and anger that the legal system could not heal. They remembered her not as a victim defined by her death, but as a woman full of life, caring for her elderly father, supporting friends, organizing hospital visits, bringing joy to everyone she touched. Her absence left a gaping hole that no verdict could fill. The story of Deputy Spivey is a story without easy heroes or villains. It is a story about perception. About how truth can splinter depending on the lens through which it's viewed. Was Renard Spivey a man fighting for his life against an enraged spouse? Or was he a man who let his darker impulses destroy everything he once held dear? The jury rendered their verdict. But in the court of public opinion, the deliberations continue, and for everyone who knew Patricia Spivey, everyone who loved her, the real verdict will always be the same. A life cut short. A future stolen. And the heartbreaking truth that no amount of justice, however imperfect, could ever bring her back. After the verdict, Renard Spivey tried to blend back into ordinary life, but in a case that had captured national attention. Fading into anonymity was never truly possible. His name had become synonymous with the trial, the scandal, the questions that still refused to die. Even though the legal system had cleared him, public perception was far less forgiving. In whispers across Houston and beyond, debates raged in barber shops, online forums, living rooms. Some saw him as a man wronged by a system eager to destroy him. Others saw a man who slipped through the cracks, cloaked in the very badge that once represented order and justice. Renard leaned heavily on his twin sister, Renee, and a small circle of friends who had stood by him. He volunteered with local charities, feeding the homeless every Sunday, speaking about healing and second chances. For Renard, these acts were a lifeline, an attempt to piece together a reputation shattered under the weight of accusations. Yet behind the public service, behind the community smiles, there were shadows he could never fully escape. Shadows cast by 3 bullets. Shadows that stained everything he touched. Meanwhile, Patricia's family struggled to move forward. For Patrina, her mother's absence was a constant ache, a missing piece that holidays, milestones, and ordinary days could never replace. Each photograph that resurfaced on social media, each memory that popped up, was another reminder of what had been stolen from her. Her grief was compounded by anger, not just at Renard, but at the system that she felt had failed her mother. The system that had demanded proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but had never demanded accountability for a woman who could no longer speak for herself. Community reaction to the verdict remained deeply divided. True crime commentators, podcasters, and YouTube analysts dissected the trial for months afterward. Some highlighted the flaws in the prosecution's case, the missing phone records, the ambiguous surveillance footage, the forensic gaps. Others zeroed in on what they called the gut feeling that Renard's story simply didn't hold. That trained officers don't accidentally shoot their wives 3 times. That calling your wife, the patient, to a 911 dispatcher wasn't the reaction of a man in true panic, and there was the gun itself. The semi-automatic weapon at the heart of the case. Defense experts argued the lack of an external safety made it dangerously easy to discharge. They demonstrated how slight pressure during a struggle could trigger multiple shots in seconds. Prosecutors, however, pointed to Renard's decades of firearm training. They argued that a man who knew guns inside and out would understand the risks better than anyone, and that such a man bore even greater responsibility to prevent tragedy. In truth, the trial had not answered everything. Key questions still lingered. Why had Renard not de-escalated the confrontation using his professional training? Why had he taken Patricia's phone into the closet in the first place? What really triggered the fight that spiraled into death? Without clear video of the shooting, without Patricia's voice, without a confession, the jury had been left with pieces that could be assembled into 2 very different stories. One of a terrified man defending himself. One of a husband crossing a line he could never uncross. The media frenzy that had initially exploded around the case eventually died down, but not completely. Every time Renard's name surfaced, whether attached to a new volunteer project or a minor appearance in local news, the old questions resurfaced. And for Patricia's family, the pain resurfaced too. They had wanted a trial to bring closure. Instead, they were left with a verdict that felt like a wound that refused to heal. The Spivey case also sparked wider discussions about domestic violence, about the warning signs that often go unnoticed or unacknowledged. Patricia's friends recounted how, over the years, her contact with them had become sporadic, her once vibrant social life dimmed by Renard's jealousy. Some now wondered if those signs had been red flags, small at first, but growing larger until it was too late. Others debated the role of perceived masculinity, how Renard's size and strength had subtly reshaped the dynamics of their relationship long before the first shot was ever fired. Defense attorneys for Renard maintained their narrative long after the trial ended. They emphasized the lack of forensic evidence tying Renard's finger to the trigger. They stressed that the burden of proof had not been met. They portrayed Patricia as angry, volatile, pushed to the edge by marital frustration and perceived betrayals. It was a version of events that painted her as the aggressor, even in death, a portrayal that her family fiercely rejected. Patrina, for her part, focused on honoring her mother's legacy. She organized memorials, raised awareness about domestic abuse, and kept Patricia's memory alive through community outreach. In interviews, she spoke less about Renard as time passed, choosing instead to focus on the life her mother lived, rather than the way it ended. She wasn't just a headline, Patrina said once in an interview. She was a caregiver, a fighter, a woman who loved deeply and deserved so much more. For Renard, the road back to normalcy was uneven. He found work in small community organizations, avoiding the spotlight wherever possible. Friends described him as haunted, changed. In quiet moments, he reportedly spoke of Patricia with sadness and regret, but never admitted guilt. His twin sister insisted he still mourned her loss deeply, that he lived with grief and guilt even if he believed in his innocence, and so, two parallel truths continued to exist. One in which a man tried to wrestle a gun away from his wife in a moment of fear. Another in which a man with a badge and a gun allowed his anger to explode into irreversible violence. The jury had chosen not to convict. But for many, the deeper verdict, the one rendered by memory, emotion, and instinct, remained forever unresolved. As time stretched onward, the story of Deputy Renard Spivey and Patricia Spivey faded from national headlines. Yet it remained vivid for those closest to it. A daughter missing her mother. A man rebuilding a life under the weight of suspicion. A community forced to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, love, and the fragility of human restraint. In the end, the Spivey case is not just a true crime story. It's a story about what happens when love turns sour, when pride outweighs peace, when the tools meant to protect us become the instruments of our destruction. It's about the moments we cannot take back. And the truths that, no matter what verdict is read aloud in a courtroom, refuse to stay buried. In the final reckoning, the case of Deputy Renard Spivey is not merely about who pulled the trigger first. It's about how quickly love can collapse under the pressure of mistrust, fear, and unspoken resentment. It's about the small moments, an unanswered question, a turned-away glance, a hidden phone, that build into something irreversible. For Patricia Spivey, the dream of building a life with the man she loved ended not with promises kept, but with gunfire echoing through a darkened home. The jury rendered their decision. The law closed its book. But for Patricia's family, for her friends, for every person who ever saw warning signs and wondered if they were overreacting, the case remains open in a deeper, more personal way. It reminds us all that appearances can deceive. That a uniform, a public smile, a polished TV image, can hide the quiet fractures growing underneath. It reminds us that tragedy often comes not from strangers, but from the people closest to us, the ones we trust the most. Renard Spivey walks free today. But the freedom he gained came at a terrible cost. And no matter how many Sundays he volunteers, no matter how many good deeds he performs, the weight of what happened that night will never fully lift. Some losses are too profound to ever escape, and so the story of Renard and Patricia Spivey remains a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered in courtrooms, living rooms, and broken hearts. Proof that sometimes, the greatest danger comes not from the world outside, but from the silent wars we wage inside our own homes, because in the end, justice is not just a verdict. It's the truth we carry with us. And some truths, no matter how hard we try, can never be silenced.
So that's how crimes end, and if you like this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe and turn on the notifications. If you want me to do some special crimes in all over the world, comment down below, or you can send us direct through email, and I will see you in all my videos. See ya!